Hi, boys and girls. This is Grandma Sheilla, and our story today is called Helpful Stranger. Well, Margie, she got up on her knees on her bed, and she looked out the window that was behind the bed. It was a beautiful, sunny, hot summer day. And she thought, oh, good. Well, then she looked around at her little brother Benny, who was 3, and her little sister. And they were still kind of sleeping there in bed. She reached over and she pushed gently on top of them. And she said, "Wake up, you 2 sleepyheads. If we don't hurry, we won't have time to get our chores done, so we have time to play this morning. Get up now." Well, Margie, she jumped off the bed and immediately got dressed. Then she turned around and she scooped up little Benny, and she got his little play clothes on. And then by that time, Blanche was dressed. Well, they went over to the table. There was breakfast sitting on the table that their mother had left, and they eagerly ate that. Well, you know, finances were really hard in those days. There were very few jobs to find. And this family had 7 children. So the only job that Father could find was to work in the fields with the farmers in the mornings at the crack of dawn. Father and Mother and their other 4 children, which were older, all went out in the fields to work. Well, those were huge, huge farm fields. And in those days, a lot of the crops had to be harvested by hand. Well, they were doing the best they could. When they worked for the farmers, they found they had to finish at one place and then load up all their things in their little trailer and put all 7 of their children in the car, and then they would drive to the next farm or maybe the next orchard to find more work there. Well, sometimes they just had to live in a tent, but other times, like this farm, they had little cabins for their workers to live in. So they had this little cabin, and Mother had fixed it up with the few things that they could carry in their trailer, like a rug that was on the floor by the bed so they didn't have to walk on the rough boards. Well, after breakfast, Margie and Blanche, one of their jobs was to make up the beds. So that's what they started to do. And they picked up one of the quilts, and they were trying to shake the wrinkles out of it, one of them on each side, and they were shaking, and the quilt was going crack, 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 up and down, and suddenly, above the noise of that quilt, there was a scream, and then that scream got softer, and it turned into cries, and occasionally another scream in between, and the girls looked at each other and went, "It's got to be Benny." Barefooted, they ran outside through the dust, making clouds of dust. And they ran around the corner where the trailer was parked. And there stood Benny by the end of the trailer. He was holding on for dear life to the edge of the trailer. It looked like he was trying to lift himself up. But then the girls realized he wasn't trying to lift his body. He was trying to lift his foot. And when they looked down, every time he tried to lift that foot up, the board underneath of it would try to come to, and he would cry out in pain. Margie got down to look, and she saw that that little tiny foot had stepped right on top of a nail that was sticking up like this, and it had gone right in to his little foot. Well, he kept crying, and Margie thought, what can I do? She tried to pull on his foot, but that just made him cry the louder, and the board kept flopping up, and that hurt. Finally, in desperation, she took both of her feet. She put one on each side of that board that was on the ground, and she put her whole weight on that board. Then she bent over. With both hands, she grabbed that little foot, and as gently as she could, she tried to pull it up off that nail. Ouch! Well, finally she succeeded, and the board fell down to the... She looked at that little foot. She held Benny real close, but he was crying. And now Blanche, she was crying too. She didn't know what to do for her little brother. She looked at both her little brother and sister crying, and she didn't know what to do for something like this. And then she turned to Blanche. She said, go get the neighbor lady. Well, generally, one of the ladies in one of the cabins stayed at home in the cabin, and she kind of watched over the children as they played, the ones that were too little to go out into the field. Well, Blanche ran to the door and she knocked, but nobody answered. She went down back to Margie, and she sat down and she said, there's nobody home. Well, now Blanche and Margie were so distressed that they both sat down and burst into tears. Margie was only 7. That's pretty little. Well, Mother had not liked the idea of leaving the 3 small children home alone, but she didn't know what else to do, and they all knew that that lady, or one of the ladies, always stayed home, so there wouldn't be a problem, but there was nobody else around. They didn't know what to do, so they sat there, and Margie kept thinking, I wished Mommy would come home. Or maybe Daddy. I wish they'd come home. Well, as they were sitting there on the ground, crying, and Benny was wailing, a stranger came walking around that trailer, and he looked at the girls, and he looked at Benny's foot, and he said, would you like me to go get your parents? And Margie said, if you only could. And the man said, all right, I'll go get them. You don't worry, you stay right here. They'll be coming soon. Well, he headed directly off into that field. It was a huge field, but somehow it was like he knew exactly where to go. He walked through the field. There were oodles of groups of people working in that field, and it was really big, but he walked straight where Mr. and Mrs. Bliss were working, and he said, "Excuse me, folks, but there's been a little accident. Your son stepped on a nail, and the little girls are really distressed. I told them that I would come to get you." And Father looked at Mother, and then he looked back at the man and he said, "Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. We'll go right now." So they started to head across the field, and Father thought, we ought to thank him again. They turned around, and they saw him walking off through the other side of the field, and they called to him, "Thank you." And then they rushed home, down through those rows, and pretty soon they were at the cabin. Well, in the meantime, Margie had picked up her brother and taken him in the house and laid him on the bed. And she had taken a washcloth and she was trying to wash off the dirt and dust that was on that little bare foot and the blood that was coming out. Well, Mother and Father, they rushed inside, and Mother picked up Benny, and she immediately got a pot of warm water, and she put some Epsom salts in it, and she put that little foot in that little pan, and she started soaking it. And Father went off to place a call to the nurse to ask her to come as soon as she could. Well, then they went back inside the cabin. They took care of Benny the best they could. And Mother and Father, they said, you know what? It's kind of odd that he knew what part of the field to go to, and he knew who we were. And then they turned to the girls and said, "Did you tell the man, the kind man, our names?" No, Margie, she shook her head. "We didn't even tell him our names, Mama. He didn't even ask." Well, after Benny was all taken care of, Father and Mother had gone back in the field, and they asked all the people around them, all the different groups that they could see. They explained what the man looked like and what he had done, and said, "We'd just like to thank him again. Does anybody know who he is?" Nobody seemed to know anybody that looked like that. Nobody knew his name. And it was rather odd, because these farm fields and the cabins were way away from the main road. And you wouldn't think a stranger would be out walking around by the fields miles away from the road. Well, as they thought about it that evening after supper, Father got down the family Bible. He said, "It's time for worship, kids. You know, morning comes early." So all 7 children sat down, and Mother sat down, and Father got out his Bible, and he started reading in Psalms 34:7. "The angel of the Lord encamps round about those who fear him, and he delivers them." Dad, he looked at Mother and the children, and he said, "You know, the only thing I can figure out was that helpful stranger was an angel." What a blessing. They all knelt down on the floor to say their evening prayers, and Father prayed and thanked God for sending an angel that day to help them and to help the little Benny with his foot and to comfort their 2 daughters at home. God is always there, willing and waiting to help us, even before we ask, 'cause I am sure that he heard little Marjorie's saying, "Oh, I wish Mommy or Daddy were here." Thank you, boys and girls. Remember that he's always there if you need him. Bye-bye now. I'll see you next week.